It's a challenging time to be a teacher. We don't get paid a lot, the days can be long and exhausting, demands from students, parents, admins, and districts can be intense. There's always room for improvement and there is always more to do. There are always new procedures to learn, new programs to run, new strategies to master. But it's when our fire burns the lowest that we remember our purpose. We teach because we're resilient. We teach because we're problem solvers. We teach because investing in kids is one of the highest callings we can imagine. We teach because we know that the classroom can be a place of magic and possibility. We teach because we have an unquenchable fire for learning and a passion to share it. We teach because our colleagues are some of the best human beings we will ever meet. We teach because we have an opportunity to influence the global citizens that will make this world a better place. If you're still on fire for learning and growth, join the Teachers on Fire Roundtable for conversations that will warm your heart, spark your thinking, and ignite your practice. You'll hear from real people and real educators with real solutions, not make-believe perfection, but ideas, inspiration, and a path toward change and transformation in K-12 education today. My name is Tim Cavey. I'm an 8th grade teacher, assistant principal, and the host of the Teachers on Fire podcast. I'm inviting you to join us at the Teachers on Fire Roundtable. Because you matter, your voice is important, and we are all better together. Welcome back, Teachers on Fire, to another conversation that will warm your heart, spark your thinking, and ignite your professional practice. My name is Tim Cavey. I am a middle school vice principal and teacher, and I'm so excited to be joined this morning by Pam Moran and Ira Socol. We will meet them in a moment, but first of all, I want to say thank you. If you are joining us in the live audience, would you say hello? Let us know where you are coming from this morning. We would love to say hi to you, and it would be great to know who we've got on board for the live broadcast. My good friend Shannon Schinkel is here this morning. Shannon, great to see you. Hailing from Prince George, BC, and host of Beyond Report Cards. So let's get into it, shall we? I have to say just one more thing before I throw to my guest here, that in advance of this show this week on Twitter, I had people reach out and say things like, Pam and Ira have forever changed the way that I teach. So some pretty high praise for these two. And with that in mind, I'm happy to throw it to them. So Pam, would you start? Let us know kind of where you are coming from. And give us a sense of your journey. Where has life and education taken you today?
Well, Tim, I have a few decades to share, so I'm going to try to compact it into just a very brief couple of statements. First and foremost, I'm coming to you from a little road in Albemarle County, Virginia. We surround the city of Charlottesville, Virginia, and are also home to the University of Virginia. So I come from Central Virginia in the United States. And my journey actually started years ago as a middle school science teacher. I also have worked in high school and spent 10 years as an elementary principal before moving into central office and ultimately spending 13 years as a superintendent of schools. And so my journey has always been, though, about how do we learn together and how do we really elevate and amplify who we are as educators? Because as I say to teachers everywhere, you are a member of the most important profession on earth. No matter what comes at you, remember that, because we live in a world where teachers are not always as regarded as they were when I started teaching. But man, I tell you what, teachers have delivered and they continue to deliver. So thank you.
Thank you, Pam. You are hitting all those right notes. And I see some comments coming in. We'll get to those in a moment. But Ira, would you tell us a little bit about your educational journey?
Well, I began sort of as a special education student, an alternative high school kid. So I have this very different background. It took me 20 years to get a bachelor's degree. And I worked in a number of fields and studied a number of things before I ended up in education. I got into education originally through special ed myself and working in assistive technologies and developing a lot of thoughts about universal design for learning before that was really a process, something in the public eye. But what I have tried to do through my work in education consistently is to challenge the status quo, which I think doesn't work for the vast majority of students, or may not work for any students at all, really, in the way we hope to help kids get to be the best people they can be and have the best lives they can lead. So I've worked with a lot of schools and a lot of public education environments, and I've spent 11 years now, going on 12, working with Pam, trying to help educators redefine the things they do every day.
Thank you so much, Ira. It is great to have you as well. Thank you to both of you for joining me here on the Teachers on Fire Roundtable. We've got Marissa Thompson, another great educator friend hailing from San Diego. Great to see you, Marissa, and I'm sure you're waking up to a beautiful, little warmer Saturday morning than I am. Margaret Murray is on LinkedIn. And she says, good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Winnipeg. That's my hometown. Great to see you. Margaret, thank you for joining us. She's a high school English teacher. Heard a little bit about middle school and high school there in that intro, and I'm hoping to hear more as we go forward. But first of all, back in 2018, I'm sure you've spoken about it so many times, it must feel in some ways like old news, but hopefully a timeless message, right? You talk about please talk about Timeless Learning, this book that you published. What was the main message of this work, and what do teachers need to know, Pam?
Well, I would start by saying that for me, Tim, the most important thing that became very clear for me as I moved through education is that the very best of who we are as educators was probably in place a millennium ago when the very first teacher landed on the side of maybe a riverbed with a stick in hand with kids gathered around and started to engage those young people in learning something that would benefit perhaps a tribal culture, a village, and that at some level, the very best of educators, I think, is who we are as storytellers, who we are as people who model how to do things, who help kids learn how to be actively engaged in gathering knowledge and skills together to grow and develop into human beings that thrive in life, and not, as Ira and I say, just learn how to survive school and the tests that we throw out on.
Yeah.
And for me, that's really the essence of timeless learning, is who are we as educators who engage hearts, minds, and hands simultaneously to really create the environments that, engage our kids and have them come to school because they want to be with us, not because they have to. Ira?
Well, I'll just add in that's, I think, the driving issue is first we ask people to decide. I think this is the question that's been lost in education over the last, say, 200 years is, what do we want our children to be? I think before that, society had a pretty good sense of what their goal was with children. Over the years of sort of standardized education, that's dropped down to what test scores do we want kids to get? What colleges do we want them to get into? And those questions are missing the critical purpose of that adults have in helping children reach adulthood.
Right. Yeah, I've been talking a fair bit lately about moving the focus to learning, which for people outside of education might strike them as a little strange or ironic, but we do so much else, and we talk so much about what students are doing, the work that they're doing, and sometimes we lose sight of what it really is all about. Pam, I loved your image, by the way, of the teacher along the riverbank with the stick gathering those children. And you're right. I mean, in some ways, that model of teaching never changes, does it? Well, part of your title really grabbed me, and I wanted to dig in a little bit deeper. Ira, maybe you could speak to this. You mentioned something that you call zero-based thinking. Zero-based thinking. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Oh my gosh, Ira, treehouse.
Treehouse, right? The nature of what we mean by zero-based thinking starts with this simple thought. If you've never seen a school, if you've never heard of a school, what would you do to get children from age 4 to age 18 or age 22 or whatever you want to say? What is it you do if you were starting from scratch? And my challenge is, I think most educators would have to admit they do very little, if anything, of what they do every day on the path to that. And so what we ask people to do is start with this sort of dreamscape. What would they like learning to be for young people as they grow? That doesn't mean you can get there instantaneously, but it gives you, what Pam and I call the North Star, the goal out there in the distance that helps you decide if every change you make, are you moving toward that goal or are you moving away from it? And what Pam just brought up was was one of our middle schools that was really struggling to get accredited, especially in math. And it was a mostly rural middle school, a very high poverty place. And we decided, the principal and I decided, and Pam discovered a little later on, that in the 2 weeks leading up to the state testing window, we would let the kids rebuild their cafeteria. All the kids in this plan. And the kids decided that what they wanted to build in their horrible 1970s cafetorium was tree houses, and tree houses that could roll so they could reset up the room in lots of different ways. It was an absolutely remarkable thing to watch in so many ways, and it helped redefine the whole school in terms of bringing kids together and things. But what was interesting about that was, because I had said to the principal, if we do the same thing as we've always done in test prep, we're going to get the same result. So we did something completely differently, and the school for the first time got fully accredited because the kids had actually worked with mathematics in a way that mattered to them. And so they picked up all the skills. And what that taught us about math, about students, about how they learned, about community, was fundamentally changed that school in a lot of ways. So
we had an architect that worked with us on that project, and the kids have gone to the principal and said, hey, we want to change the cafeteria. We don't like it because, we don't get to talk to each other. It's noisy. It's this, it's that. So my picture, Tim, was that Ira and the principal got a little mini grant, and they decided to bring in a guy from Philadelphia who's an architect that does what he calls tiny WPA projects in communities where they do builds. Okay. And they do kind of zero-based builds, Ira, because they just kind of design it almost from looking at what they want to build and then redesign it till they
don't draw plans, and it's always kid designed.
Yeah.
What do you want to do here?
But I had in my head, I'm a superintendent, so I had in my head at the time that what the kids were maybe going to do was to go into their makerspace lab and maybe build some booths, benches, maybe throw some posters on the wall, bring in some green plants, done, check, dining experience, project finished. Mm-hmm. I saw on Instagram these pictures and the ones on the front of our book going up of this tree house. And I immediately called Ira and the principal and said, what the heck is going on down there? And Ira says to me, well, Pam, the kids, they didn't want to build booths. They wanted to build tree houses. And he said, actually, they wanted to build rolling tree houses. I was like, well, those are what, about 8 feet? And he said, no, actually, they're about 14. But the architect, we did a reflective debrief with the architect. It hasn't been that long ago. And one of the things he said to me about that project is he said, Pam, it's really like an old style, it was really like an old style barnstorming because it brought parents into the school, dads who worked in construction that had never maybe found themselves in a school before. It brought teachers in. You had, maths teacher who was teaching a special ed collaborative class said, I have kids that learned how to use fractions in 2 weeks that I couldn't teach them in the prior 6 months because they were using it to build. Right. And so that's really what we see as kind of metaphorical for what zero-based thinking is. How do you do something that's totally off the map in terms of what you might think you're going to do? And one of the things that we're working on now is the concept of co-design, because we believe that when kids come into the process of helping to design their own learning, whether it's working on curriculum, assessment, or instruction, that all of a sudden you get a very different space being created as a learning space for kids. So
all about co-creating, co-designing, have those students invested, right? And taking part in the process. They are not spectators. They should be at the center of what's going on. Well, on that theme, let's keep going and ask this question. I'll go back to you, Ira. We often hear that the K-12 path is a sure way to destroy curiosity in learners. So thinking about that and sort of where we've been, what can schools and teachers do to counter this, do you think? How can we stoke those fires of curiosity all the way to graduation?
One of the things, Tim, is I think we less have to stoke the fires than stop stamping the fires out. The nature of it is I always find things like growth mindset pretty funny, because to be a child, to be an adolescent, is to be in a growth mindset. That is the genetic design of those periods of life, and they are learning everything all the time. What we're missing is that often what we're teaching are some really horrible things, what kids are taking away from what we do during the day. A long time ago, when I was first getting involved in education, I heard a dean from Cornell say that we do everything completely backwards. He said every 5-year-old walks into school ready to learn physics and geometry. Those are the natural sciences. Those are the absolute curiosity pieces. I bounce a ball, what happens? I dig a hole, what happens? All those things. And instead, we waste this incredible amount of time teaching children who are just simply not ready for it symbolic languages, and only get to the things that actually might interest kids if they ever get there when they're in like 9th or 10th grade. And so instead of using what kids are interested in, we fight that all the time. The teacher that I always describe as saving my life, language arts teacher in the alternative high school I went to, always described it as the judo theory of education. We take whatever kids are bringing to us and use that energy to help them get where they want to go. And that requires that we give up on concepts like, mass instruction and pacing guides and things like that, because curiosity is not necessarily a group thing. And curiosity doesn't run on timelines. I've probably gone to 1,000 or more IEP conferences in my time in education. And at almost every one, somebody says, he does a lot better if he's interested. And I think, oh, wow, that's really quite an insight there. We need to let kids get outside, take risks, investigate the things that are fascinating to them. When we do that, if we're good, if we're mentors and we're guides, we can bring any knowledge into those things, and kids will jump on it, because kids will do really hard learning work if it's in pursuit of something important to them.
And that doesn't mean that the knowledge that adults really see as being critically important for children to learn just gets set aside. But what it does really demand is that you have to find those connection points that allow kids to find the interest in and curiosities about knowledge that does have some critical importance. And too often, one of the things that we've been working with some folks on is that too often what we do is we spend 90% of our time down at that recall level, preparing kids to take tests that look oftentimes very traditional. And kids never get to the place where they get to create, design, amplify, communicate, really think in deep ways about things that should be curiosity points in the world today. And I think that, at the high school level, there's probably been nothing that could have been more amazingly interesting than, in a sort of a sad, depressing way, but the whole database that's come out of the pandemic is such a real world opportunity for kids to really engage in mathematical thinking and actually learn some skill sets that help them to figure out what's credible, what's not, how do you really use math? How do people that are in the field use math? What is this really telling us about our culture, our world, our community, our own bodies, et cetera? But we oftentimes back away from some of those shifts because we're so concerned about getting kids over the hurdle of pretty traditional assessments. And so one of the things that, Tim, that we really talk about and worked on ourselves for a lot of years together with amazing staff who were right there front and center in doing this work is, how do you really look at education as more of an ecosystem or a systems thinking model where if you change the curriculum or you change instruction to be a really exciting space to be, let's say around problem-based or project-based learning or inquiry by design, if you're doing those things instructionally and then your kids are still going to hit those traditional assessments, it really does impact whether the system can align to really full throttle that curiosity, interest, and passion that kids have for learning into something that truly is lifelong versus just ephemeral to get through an assessment. And so I don't know if I know that Canada for many years was really leading, was on a leading edge in some parts of Canada regarding assessments. In fact, in some of my early years as an administrator, I was taking some of the lessons by design coming out of Canada and saying, how can we apply this to the work we're doing right where I was a principal? But I think that that's a critical piece of where all educators have to think is, if curriculum, instruction, and assessment, resources, culture, time are not becoming aligned on behalf of children, we really impede our capability to be at our full throttle as educators.
I completely agree, Pam. And your point about assessment, I think, can't be overstated. If we are asking kids to take all kinds of creative risks on the one hand, and then we are still penalizing them and punishing them for taking risks on the other hand in these traditional assessment models, that's not going to work. So our assessment practices and our instruction have to evolve alongside. And I don't know if Shannon Schinkel is still on board with us today on the show, but Shannon, we were talking a couple of weeks ago about this idea that supports are really best practices. And I think about Ira's comment from the IEP meeting about how, Johnny will do better if he's working on something he's interested in. And that really applies to all students, right? That kind of thinking applies across the board.
Teachers.
Well, yeah.
Too.
Yeah, and teachers too, that's right. Well, Pam, I want to go back to you and talk about this idea of student agency. And so in Timeless Learning, you write about PBL, you write about student design learning. We've already talked about that briefly. Maker learning and, of course, the maker space, which is something we maybe heard a little bit more about in past years. We're not hearing about it as much today, but hopefully it's still a real part of most schools. Why do you think these are important, and how do you see them showing up? And maybe, since you've already touched on this a little bit, do you see the future direction of some of these spaces changing as we go forward.
Yeah, I think that like all good ideas, that the tools evolve, the strategies may shift in some ways, the curriculum may actually. I spent the morning, Tim, learning from my son, who's a fairly still young millennial, about NFTs, and I got really motivated.
Oh, yeah.
I got to get some of my husband's cartoons out that he did that are digital. About how do I turn those into NFTs? And then he says, well, you've got to go get this thing called Ethereum, and then you got to get into this blockchain stuff. The next thing I'm going, my head's exploding, but I'm thinking this is really an interesting new evolution. And I immediately asked the question, I wonder what art teachers out there are getting their kids engaged in building NFTs right now that they can put up for sale, and potentially, rather than being a buyer, they become a seller of their work in that environment. So anyway, but so yeah, I do think that these are all important, because again, you go back to timeless learning, that the way that humans learn, Lego got it 1,000 years ago. Well, not
right.
that long, but a few decades ago, that hands-on learning leads to minds-on thinking, and that the more that we give kids experiences to build with their hands and then to seek the knowledge they need to really get better and better at that process, it puts them into a mode of having to be communicators, critical thinkers, creative producers, collaborators, and basically people who then are at the heart of their learning are entrepreneurial learners. And so those things I think are timeless. And I think that one of the reasons why it keeps coming back to education is because at the heart of who we are as humans, we are driven to make, to inquire, to work on project work, both in our workplace as well as in our homes. And so, I think that the big shift for me right now is how do we continue to have kids using state-of-the-art technologies, but not forgetting that learning how to use a hammer, a drill, a pen, a piece of paper, an art brush, all of those tools do what Ira really believes and basically put out there 15 years ago, Ira, and that's the concept of the tool belt. The more tools that we can put in our kids' tool belts, the better that they will be in terms of their homes, their communities, their work in a workforce, as human beings, as people who see themselves as connected to other human beings. That's what that work does for me, is that it moves us from our kids being isolated learners to being people who see themselves as part of a learning community, whether it's in a classroom, a school, a greater community that's more place-based, or the world. Ira, you might have, I know you've got some things to add to that.
Well, just, quickly, in terms of makerspaces, when we started creating makerspaces, we talked about them being transitional ideas as a way, as a lab where teachers and students could learn together how to use these things. The idea being that the entire schools would become makerspaces. And some of the schools moved quicker than that. The school where Pam had been principal decade before, instead of building makerspace, we built maker carts, just rolling carts filled with tools that kids could take wherever they needed to build. And then we created what we called mechatronics labs, which combined all sorts of tools that you wouldn't have in a regular classroom, from very high-end desktop computers to bandsaws and welding equipment. And at our peak of that mechatronics lab just opened seamlessly into a high school's hallways. There were no walls, no doors, no anything. There were mall gates you could pull down if you needed to close it off at night. But the idea being that kids would just go to these places when they needed to, that this would be a normal part of education. I just wanted to add a couple of comments that popped up while Pam was talking. I say a couple of things about 20% time or that Google time concept. And I say,
Oh, no, here he goes.
what our real goal is that we would have 20% of direct instruction, mass instruction time, and 80%, sort of maker time and invention time. Because if you think about it, that's what people do in a real world. They work on the things they're curious about, they're interested about, and then people with more knowledge step in momentarily and say, here's how you do this. This will help you go to that spot, and this will help you move forward. The other thing that I think is really important about Google Time is that people understand it's not about doing anything kids want. Although I always say time for kids to do anything they want should be part of every school day. But the Google Time is how do I or do we help solve some problem in our life, our community, our world, whatever it is. And it can be a very small problem. It can be a very big problem. But that act of engaging kids in problem solving not only fires up learning, but it teaches kids that the world is about more than just themselves. And if certainly the United States needs anything to happen in schools, it's that. And I suspect a lot of the rest of the world does too.
And I would just add to that, one of the things that we saw as we started really going after that active engagement mode, and we had kids that became amazing writers of poetry that turned into rap, that turned into production, that turned into iTunes sales. So borrowing a little bit from riffing with the Don Wettrick model, that kids can become people who actually are learning on the job skills at the same time that they're really putting together content that's pretty amazing. But one of the things that we started to hear from our educators and that we started to see is that as we really unleash, and it's true today, whether we're working in Pennsylvania or Kentucky or Vermont or Wisconsin or any places that we, lots more, that one of the things that we notice is that when people start to engage in that sort of contagious creativity, our educators start to see kids as having interesting talents and skills. And as Ira says, kids don't come to school knowing less who come from poverty or circumstances that are challenging. They come knowing differently. And when teachers start to see that, they start to notice there's a heck of a lot more kids that have gifts and talents in their schools than they notice. We started flipping our summer school programs into maker camp environments where kids were learning the content, but they were in sort of maker-driven work. And this principal calls up one day and says to me, Pam, I think I've got a kid here I want to recommend for the gifted program. I said, yeah, but she's in your program this summer because she hasn't passed in Virginia in the United States. Our state tests are known as what, Ira?
SOLs.
Yeah. As Ira says, truth in advertising. So this young girl, fifth grader, had failed some of our state tests. And so she was in summer maker camp to do some recovery work or discovery work, as we called it. Principal said, this kid has an amazing capability to engineer and design using Arduinos. And she's building all these different versions of Arduino-powered cars that are running around in the halls. And she says, I've never seen such an engineering mind in a kid.
Wow.
That kid would have never been seen. And so as we started to our goal was that we would take those sort of small prototype or pilot projects, sort of the getting to yes work that we did, give it an opportunity to grow and develop. And then how do we really drift that across the system so that it starts to impact not just those places that we didn't want that maker work to become like a destination space, just like we didn't want libraries to be a destination. We wanted it to be an integral part of everything going on in the schools. And so our goal is that, a school that we work with in Pennsylvania, Keith Valley Middle School, we went through a process with them of Ira asking that question, what do you want to be? And one of the things that jumped out at us is when the teachers kind of landed on their sort of flagship tagline was, we want every learner to fit everywhere. Mm. They didn't want to have kids be misfitted to any area of the school. They wanted them to be able to find a good fit everywhere in the school. And I think about that's what engagement work does. If we were doing slideshow presentations, Ira would probably throw up his engagement slide data right now, Ira, which is pretty abysmal for most public schools, right?
Well, and one of the things I say, and we just said this recently up in Pennsylvania, not in that school, but when schools talk about some very problematic students, we found that when we changed the instruction model to this maker, curiosity-driven student agency model, that a whole lot of our most problematic kids, and Pam, you know exactly what I'm talking about, turned into like our most incredible learners. Whether they were, turned out to be like award-winning entrepreneurs or prize-winning designers of an autonomous sailboat that could sail on the ocean. These were kids that would have been described as major behavior problems and major concerns of teachers. And instead, what we did was, this is always the thing of liberating learning, of finding what is the magic for each individual child. And that's really the driving thing. So I often say, if you want to solve your discipline or your achievement problems, it's not the kids who need to change. It's the adults in the building who need to change the everyday.
And as Iris says, and this also has really stuck with me since the first time I heard him say it to a group of teachers, is that you as educators are not the problem. It's the system that's the problem. You're doing what the system's asking you to do. Right. And so for me, it's about the leadership really stepping up to support up and make it a risk-taking by our educators something that is acceptable and expected, rather than something that people are afraid to engage in, because if they do, that they're worried about their careers, their livelihood, et cetera. It doesn't mean that everybody's ready to take a risk all at the same time. But one of the things that we really took a lesson from is the concept of skunk works, which started in World War II, where you have people who are really willing to take those risks. And if you can support them up and help to provide them with the resources and the time and the space to work on how do we move over the horizon and try some things out, what you're able to do is to really mitigate putting everybody at risk. And you're able to build the protections around that group so that they can try some things differently, and those things that work. And it doesn't mean that you just say, well, anything goes. What you're really looking for are, what are the things that are going to really impact the learning that our kids are able to do, and who gets, of all of our kids, how do all of our kids get access to really great learning experiences that help to move them forward towards life goals. And I stopped a few years ago, really Ira made the comment one time, he said, saying that you want kids to be college and workforce ready is kind of a low bar. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, in reality, the greater gift to our kids would be if our kids leave us and they believe their voice matters. If they have agency in their learning so that they take that with them, that's in their portfolio the day they walk out of high school, that they see themselves as agents of their own learning, and they believe that they have influence and they've actually had opportunities to have influence, that is such a greater gift to our young people than just saying, we want you to be skill ready to go to college or into the workforce. That's important. Right. But maybe the most important thing is that our kids are really ready for life, and they see themselves as being powerful learners and that they're taking that with them as part of their portfolio. I'm kind of channeling a little bit of you on that, but
well, it's, to me, it's just that whole question is what do we want our children to be? And one of the things I've said, Tim, a lot is that I'd like us to judge ourselves as educators based in how many choices our kids have when they turn 30. Then we'll know whether we succeeded or not. Can kids, because one of the things we know right now is that probably 90% of what we're teaching will not be of particular importance in 15 years. The world is changing really fast. And, my experience with that was being a graphic arts student, when I first went to college, and I learned many things, but not one of the technical skills I learned there was of any value 5 years later, because the tools all changed radically. What was important was the sense of creativity and how to communicate effectively, or how to communicate what I was intending to. So it's impossible to make kids career ready at this point in life because we don't know what careers will exist. It's impossible, or not impossible. It's not of particular value to make kids college ready at this point, because college may look completely different in a decade, if it exists at all, in the form, because of the way, learning is changing in the world. And so it's, are you learning ready? Are you choice ready? Will you be able to decide where to live, what kind of work to do, what kind of family to be part of, how to influence your community? That's what matters. And that requires a really significant rethink of the everyday. And
Ira, time. I remember when Joe Matthew, principal in Kentucky, said to us, we were probably 50% way through where we are right now with pandemic stuff. And they were getting ready to bring kids back into school. His kids have been out of school in virtual learning. And one of the kids said to him, so Mr. Matthew, when I come back, I'm not sure I actually want to go back to high school. He said, because, every day I've been learning how to play the guitar using YouTube. And I just want to know how you're going to set up a schedule that lets me keep doing that.
Wow.
So that's one of the things that Ira also, he and I really try to work with people on is, how do you think about time differently? Because we are so lockstepped into the traditions of using time that really do go back to that, sort of industrial 1900 time frame of, as Ira says, getting kids ready to go to work in the factories demanded that we put bell schedules in and blocks of time. And this is when you eat lunch. And this is when you get a bathroom break or not. And, we haven't really gone after that with any focus on how do people really use time as learners in natural, real ways. Ira, anything that you want to kick in on the time?
I know we're running, we're heading toward the end here.
Speaking of time. Yeah.
Right. Speaking of time. But one of the things is, it's unfortunate that the history of education isn't taught in many ed schools, because people tend to think there are things that are natural and traditional that are not at all. One-room schoolhouses did not ring the bell for kids to come to school. Kids came to school when their chores at home were done, and they left school when their work at school was done for the day, or they had to go back and do stuff at home. The whole idea of separating out areas of curriculum during the day is an 1890s idea that was put in as part, along with textbooks, in hopes that people could hire uneducated teachers who could read a script. And so many of the things we do all the time, we think are somehow natural. But as I always say to people, these were put in for some really awful, awful reasons. There's a letter from the head of Cult Firearms to the superintendent of schools in Connecticut back in the 1860s saying, we're putting shift work in, and you guys have to have a school schedule to train your kids into it. Bells are factory whistles. That's what they're there for. When you think about even age-based grades, another great letter I have is from superintendent of schools in Michigan in 1905 saying the idea that all 8-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 15-year-olds should be studying the same thing is so ridiculous, it's incomprehensible. But we have accepted these tools of the Industrial Revolution as if they matter now. And it's kind of like insisting that we should build cars like they did in 1915 because, that's what we've always done. And this is what's holding students back by holding teachers back.
And when we were in Ireland, Tim, this was probably one of the epiphanies of my life. And, I'd been in schools that had done combination grades, a little bit of multi-age. But in Ireland, many of the schools operate as multi-age spaces with children not grouped by, sort of the time stamp of their birth date. And I asked a teacher there who had probably a mix of kids from around probably 5 to 11, Ira, something like that. And I said to her, wouldn't you rather have all your 8-year-olds together? And she said, I don't really understand that. She said, because if I had all my 8-year-olds together, how would they ever learn to be 9? And it just really struck me that, and then we posed a similar question to a parent whose comment was, well, if my child was only with the same age, it was only with 8-year-olds, how would they learn to take care of the wee ones? And so, our goals and values in the United States, and I'm not going to in any way, shape, or form bring Canada into that philosophical mix, but the reality is that we think that what we do is normative and it's the way it has to be. But all over the world, including in Canada and including in the United States, and really great schools that are taking on how do we really move to a place where all of our kids are getting an incredibly high quality, high engagement in education, that what we do normatively in most of our schools is not the way it has to be or the way that it is. And so that's one of the things that we also try to do, is to challenge people with that. We love a school in Massachusetts, a high school in Massachusetts, where the principals, co-principals in a high school meet with kids on a bi-weekly or monthly basis. And they ask the kids to bring a teacher, and they engage in what they call the what if protocol. What if we change this? What would happen? And then they take that pool of what ifs and actually pick some to do, to change about the school. And so it starts with the kids, it engages with the teachers in a co-design model. But what we really believe is that when you do that what if thinking versus the yeah, but thinking that we're quick to go to, all of a sudden you get timeless learning.
Some really great mic drop moments there from both of you. Ira, I wanted to circle back and just say that I know the three of us are familiar with the work of Don Wettrick, and you talked, Ira, about sort of reimagining the shape of the school day. And Don and I had a good conversation there about startup culture, right? And the startup companies and the way they work together to solve problems, and they're not confined by time boundaries or shifts or, a 9 to 5. It's all about just getting the job done. Well, we have to wrap up. Unfortunately, I had more in store, but you've touched on so many juicy topics here today, and I know provided a ton of value. As we wrap up, could you talk about what is one current project, bit of research or writing or presenting? I know you both offer a lot of consulting, so tell us about some of your current work that is firing you up right now, Ira.
I think what we are learning constantly is what are the options and how do we get people there? So one of our big things that we're trying to work with people on constantly is that co-design nature. What is it like to let students lead the way. Students are our end users. As I say all the time, if the only reason we have jobs is because there are kids. So they're the end users. And we use a lot of the tech concepts of, if this is our goal, what's the user experience that will get kids to that goal? And if that's the user experience we want, how do we build the user interface, which is our school building, our school day, our instruction, everything about it, including how kids are fed and kids get to school. How do we build a user interface that actually creates the experiences that will help our children grow? It's a challenge to move people from the way that education is taught in colleges of education into that kind of thinking that everything has to center around what matters to the end user, not the convenience of adults. And one of the quotes I give all the time, and then I'll shut up here, but is from William Alcott in 1839, when he said, "Too often we consult our needs and preferences instead of the needs of our children." That's right at the beginning of public schooling in North America.
Right.
And it was a problem then, and we're still trying to solve it.
So good. Pam, talk a little bit more about the services that you and Ira can offer schools, districts, and education leaders.
Ira and I work with schools, we work with districts, we work with networks, really helping educators figure out how do you go from the why to the how and the what, so that, we're really focused on boots on the ground protocols you can use to help move educators into their becoming actively engaged in the process of change, so that it's not the top down in isolation of all of the parts of the system. We kind of think that everybody should be a part of that process of understanding and developing the why, and then focusing on the how. So we really work on that. We work with people on learning space design, on building out their why through North Star, portrait of the graduate kind of work. But our goal is never to become, as consultants, the crutch to a system so that you're always having to come back to us. Our goal is, how do we build the capacity of all of the people that we work with to create the environment inside their system so that the changes become part of the system. And we talk about it through the lens of helping people figure out what and how do you put things into your innovation portfolio? How do you test bed those ideas in order to then impact your strategic focus and eventually have those things that really rise to the top as highly engaging work that moves more kids closer to that North Star? How is it that then becomes operational? But you never stop, just like every good corporation has those innovation spaces, those R&D spaces. We really try to help people build research and development space and then figure out, how do we have that be a successful space to influence the system? So that's what we do. And we try to make that something that's real in terms of strategies, activities, and protocols. And our gift to people is that when we walk away, you don't need us. You've got what you need to keep that work moving so that your organization thrives in this work. So in some ways, I think that what we do is a little bit of the bigger picture of the work that Don's doing. And that is almost, how do you help organizations build startup culture inside schools? Usually we look to people outside the system to provide us with programs and products. How do you put your resources into your people, not into those outside sources of products and services? So does that make sense, Tim?
It makes perfect sense, and you're talking my language there, Pam. I'm digging everything you're saying. In fact, I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to have to re-listen to this entire conversation. There have been so many truth bombs and ideas of inspiration for me, and I know for my listeners. Last question, how can we connect? How can we continue the learning journey with the two of you if we're interested in what you've been putting down here today? Pam, for everyone listening live on the replay or listening to the podcast, how can we connect with you?
Easy. You can catch me on Twitter pretty much any day of the week at some point. I'm at Pam Moran, or you can email us and you can catch up with me, Pam Moran at socolmoran.com. Pretty easy. We've tried to make things easy. Ira, you want to kick to you?
Well, just my name, Ira Socol on Twitter, Ira Socol at socolmoran.com. Twitter, if you jump on Twitter and connect with us, we will figure out the best way to connect with you. We love to hear from people and love to hear what people are. We love to hear about your success stories, not just the things you need help with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're about to ink a contract on our next book that's going to be built around the co-design, principles of co-design, and how, with lots of concrete examples of people that are already doing that work. And of course, Timeless Learning is everywhere and anywhere on Kindle. Ira's favorite is to catch it in an audio book, or you can get it on paper. But it's got a lot of our stories, as well as one of the things that we built into that, Tim, is opportunities that if people want to take that and use it at the end of every chapter, we created some activity and strategy experiences that people could use on their own to start doing that work in their own systems. We felt like that we didn't want to just be a why and a what sort of storybook. We wanted to also provide some of the how. And so we did embed that in the book as well. So, but we, as with everything, we see our next steps as being evolving to this greater bandwidth of student involvement and engagement as co-partners in the learning with the educators, not just the recipients. We see that as a next evolutionary step in the work for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the way that both of you continually recenter the learning and everything we do in our education systems on students and on what's really important. I'll tell you what, Ira and Pam, we'll need to have a part 2. I'm going to ask you to come back on the show when that new book comes out, because I'll tell you what, we've got more questions to get to, including this juicy tweet that I wanted to hear from Ira about. We're out of time for today. But Ira, I like what you're dropping here, getting a little bit edgy, and so I look forward to hearing more about that. But Ira and Pam, thank you so much for sharing your Saturday generously with us here today. It's as I said, it's brought a ton of value and a lot of good thinking points. So take care, and I'm so glad to be connected. Yeah, go ahead, Pam.
I just was going to say, thrilled to be with you, and shout out to you for putting together what I call the best couch development that people can get. And that is to be able to come to your live streams, whether it's synchronously or asynchronously. And I oftentimes will watch asynchronously, but it's really great content and very provocative. So thank you. And congratulations on being recognized for the work you're doing to put this all together.
I'm so humbled. It's fun for me. It keeps my learning engaged, keeps me on fire, and it's thanks to amazing leaders like you. I'm just humbled to have the opportunity to chat with the two of you with such incredible pedigrees. As Ira said, I love the phrase that he dropped in our private chat of pedagogical entrepreneurs. I'm going to stick to, I think I need to add that one to my bio. That's something that I would like to strive for. But take care, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I know we will talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.